Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast on all things repro. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and each episode I will be taking you to the front lines of the escalating fight over our sexual and reproductive health and rights at home and abroad. Each episode, I will be speaking with leaders who are fighting to protect our reproductive health and rights, to ensure that no one's reproductive health depends on where they live. It's time for rePROs to fight back. Welcome to rePROs Fight Back. On this week's episode, we are going to talk about the many attacks by the Trump-Pence administration on the transgender community. Helping me dig into this topic, I'm really excited to have with me Katelyn Burns, a freelance journalist covering LGBTQ and reproductive health issues, and the first openly trans Capitol Hill reporter here today to talk to me. Hi, Katelyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'm so excited to finally be talking about trans issues on the podcast.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
We're going to do a deep dive into the healthcare stuff, but unfortunately, that is definitely not the only area that the Trump and Pence administration has been going after. So I figured we'd do kind of a bit of a rapid fire-ish talk of some of the many other areas that they have gone after the trans community. And we'll start with the military ban.
Yeah. So the military ban is sort of the headline. I have my own theories as to why this seems to be getting the most attention. I think it most directly affects the white trans community. So I feel like that gets disproportionate attention within the LGBT advocacy orgs that do the work. But also it's the only anti-trans policy that Trump has actually tweeted about.
That's true.
And I wrote about this recently, but I think that there are too many mainstream media reporters who take their story cues directly from Trump's Twitter feed. And they're not necessarily doing a deeper policy dive into some of these things. And I think this is why that, the military ban gets so much attention, but it's not nearly the only attack on the trans community, nor the most devastating. There's, countless other areas where they're actively making life more difficult for particularly trans people of color.
I was really surprised. And so as someone who absolutely tries to stay on top of these things, I went to the National Center for Trans Equality and was looking at, they have a list of all the things. And I think it was 5 pages printed out. And it was shocking to me, even with the many I knew about, there were a lot that I just wasn't as familiar with. And since one, we don't have 20 hours to talk about all of them, I'll make sure to include that resource in the show notes. But yeah, it's just kind of boggles my mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple that are particularly devastating. The healthcare one, I think, is the most devastating of all. But within the same week that policy was announced, or that proposed rule was announced, they also announced a proposed rule that would allow homeless shelters that receive federal funding to just straight up not house trans people at all, or force trans people to be housed with their birth sex. So if I ended up homeless, they could force me into a men's shelter, even though, I haven't, lived as a man for years. I've not to get too personal, but I have female genitalia at this point. But at this point, with this proposed rule, as they're making it sound it's going to be, none of that matters. And somebody can just force their own interpretation of your life on somebody. And we're not talking about the average trans person. We're talking about somebody who literally has nothing and nowhere else to go. So it's either live in the street or live in these shelters where they're being sexually assaulted or just straight up beaten for who they are. Sorry, I'm going to cry.
It's devastating. And not only on its face, but also because the transgender community is disproportionately a part of the homeless community. And it's just such a cruel and senseless attack. Yeah, that one really got me. And I also feel again, yes, the religious refusal rule definitely overshadowed it. And I feel like a lot of people, I didn't see a ton of conversation other than in the usual suspects community that you would expect to hear on Twitter or whatever talking about it. Like, I really feel like that the homeless shelter rule was really going unnoticed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We haven't seen the actual text of the rule yet, so I'm hoping that when that gets rolled out, there's a little bit more attention. I will certainly be looking to write about it, if there are any editors that listen to your show.
Yes. We'll make sure. And it's really, it is just like such an attack on the community, because even when you look at it, it's simple things. Like, there was like the big thing, again, time is a flat circle under the Trump administration, and I have no concept of time, but I think it was 2 years ago, where the CDC had this list of banned words, and transgender was one. Like, if we don't say it, they don't exist. Mm-hmm. Like, it just, again, blows my mind that...
I mean, that's been the central policy of this administration from day one. I mean, they rolled back literally the first thing they did after reinstituting the global gag rule was they rolled back the Obama-era guidelines for trans students. It wasn't even guidelines. It was just like a suggested guidance for what schools should be doing with trans students. And they literally just wiped it out in the first week. And it was a signal of what was to come. And honestly, I wasn't surprised in the least. And it's just continued from there. So it just gets worse and worse. We have a case in front of the Supreme Court now to determine whether... gender identity is included under Title VII employment law, and that's actually important not just to trans people, but it should be important to cisgender women as well, because the case that sort of undergirds... Okay, so to back up a little bit and set the legal background, there have been, dozens of court rulings over the years determining that trans people are covered under Title VII because, surprise, we also have a sex and we have sex-based rights.
What?
Yeah, trans people are not sexless no matter what anybody else tries to say, right? But the case that sort of undergirded the employment rules was Hopkins v. Waterhouse, which is a very famous case where there was a cisgender lesbian, butch lesbian who, wore a pantsuit to work every day, did not wear makeup, wore her hair short, did not, spoke gruffly, I think they said in the case. And the people at Waterhouse, which is a financial firm, or an accounting firm, just straight up refused to promote her because she wasn't wearing dresses or skirts or wearing makeup or conforming to what their ideals of womanhood was. And so that case has sort of undergirded these further rulings on whether or not trans people should be included under employment protections. And that's the precedent that would be overruled if the Supreme Court rules against trans people. So I hope that people realize that it's not just trans people that they're coming for. They're hoping to put trans people out of your mind and women back in their place. I don't think people are scared enough about this possible decision. I think too often we separate out these cases or these issues into these silos and not realize that they're all interconnected. And that includes... trans healthcare, I consider to be reproductive healthcare.
Or just healthcare, right?
Yeah.
We'll get into this more later, but
I know we're headed in that direction.
When people think of it, they think that it means your doctor isn't forced to do gender reassignment surgery. And no, it's your doctor isn't required to treat your broken bone because you're trans. And that is bananas.
I'm not showing up at the local Catholic emergency room looking for vaginoplasty. Nobody does that.
Yeah.
It's specialist care to the max, right? It's just, you don't show up to an emergency room looking for getting a prosthetic leg, right? So you go to a specialist for that stuff, right? So I don't really buy this, they're trying to force doctors to perform these things that they don't approve of. To a point, right? Because the Catholic Church has made this argument that gender reassignment surgery is sterilizing, which is against their religion. So here again, we're connecting the two.
Right.
They consider like just hormone replacement therapy to be sterilizing, which it isn't always. In fact, more and more research is showing that it's reversible for reproduction. Anyway, not to get too in the weeds with it, but like they're claiming that top surgery for trans men is sterilizing, but it's not, right? That's just, come on.
I feel like someone needs to send them a general, like, how reproduction works.
Right. And it's like, we have formula, like, this isn't, but, you know, religious people, like, religious organizations particularly, I shouldn't say religious people, because they're not all like that, but the conservative wing of these religious organizations, you know, will stretch anything to get their way.
That is one episode we have not done. So we've done things on religious refusals. I had a conversation with someone about faith and reproductive rights, but we haven't done anything specifically on Catholic hospitals, which, don't worry, it's coming. It is in my sights because there are any number of services that people don't know they're not getting when they go to a Catholic affiliated hospital. So also there was a Justice Department ruling allowing federal agencies, contractors, grantees to discriminate based on religious reasons, which again seems very targeted at the trans community, just so we're getting back to that laundry list, and then we'll go straight into healthcare. Yeah,
they basically rolled back. It wasn't just trans people, it was LGBT people. So Obama had issued an executive order that banned, you know, federal agencies and contractors from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and Trump came in and just basically like wiped that out. So basically any federal contractor now can just say, nope, we're not having, you know, those people work for us anymore. And we're all of a sudden we're back in the 80s. It's just,
there's so many things that just are completely foreign to me. Like, I just can't understand that. Like, they're people, they're just trying to work. Like,
I mean, I have friends here in DC who work for federal contractors, and, you know, if their boss leaves and the organization hires a religious person, they're out of a job, and it's just end of, and they have no control over it, and it's just really not, it's not right.
And again, I think that's one of those decisions that was like maybe a little bit of a flash in the pan when it happened, but never hear it talked about anymore, right. or most people have kind of forgotten about it.
And again, I think it's because we keep these issues too siloed, and it's like, oh, this issue affects these people, and not realizing the connecting undercurrent of all of it, which is something that I've tried to bring to my work, is to explain, like, hey, there's connectedness to all of this.
We're all in this together.
Right.
Like, they hate all of us.
Yeah. This is why, like, transphobic feminists, I really don't understand. Not to go there, but
I didn't even really realize it was a thing, because, like...
You're not British, so...
Right, and then I started hearing about TERFs, I'm like, what is that? And I'm like, you can't be a radical feminist to be trans exclusionary. I'm sorry, like, no, that's not how this works. So many other things that could be their own topic.
I mean, wouldn't it be amazing to work together to end male violence? Like, anyway.
So many.
We could spend an entire show just talking about this.
Okay, anyway, HHS.
Yes.
So, we've already kind of talked a little bit, but religious refusals, what are they?
Just to take a step back, right? So, there's actually been two rules that have been introduced, or proposed, right? One is religious refusals, which covers anybody who has religious objection to certain aspects of reproductive health, like abortion care or birth control, or whether it's Plan B, is also being extended to cover like hormone replacement therapy, or, you know, top surgery, which again, I don't understand. Like bottom surgery, there's like 20 people in the entire country who do this, and none of them are opposed to it based on religion. So, like, this is a non-starter for me. There's another rule that's been introduced or proposed by HHS, which would basically allow any medical provider to just not treat trans people for anything, right? So I've run into this myself as a trans person back when I lived in Maine, and I wrote about this recently for Vox. I it was like the second time I'd ever refilled my hormone prescription. I had just moved, I just separated from my then wife, and I moved to a new town, and I had a new pharmacy, and I show up just to renew, because I had been going to a CVS, and I was going to a new CVS, and it should have been fine.
Right.
The doctor or the pharmacist was like, yeah, we canceled that prescription. And I was like, excuse me? And they're like, well, sir, do you understand what this medication does? And I was like, yes, I do. I've been on it for a while now. I think the doctor made a mistake because this is female hormones. And I was like, yep, I'm aware. And like I had my kids in the backseat and they didn't know I was transitioning yet because I just hadn't gotten to. And I'm like hoping that they're distracted enough that they're not paying attention to what's actually being said. And I was just like, no, I understand what this is. Like, this is a legitimate prescription. And the woman goes, well, we canceled it because we couldn't figure out why somebody with your name would be taking female hormones. And I'm just like, and that wasn't even, like, there was no religious basis to that refusal. Right. It was just,
I'm not going to do it.
I'm not going to do it, right? And it was humiliating. I ended up going to a different pharmacy and I got it filled, but I had to wait a few days. So, I mean, on the whole, like, it wasn't like a grievous injury to me other than the fact that it was completely humiliating and potentially added me to my children. But I did tweet about it at the time, and I didn't have nearly as many followers as I do now. Mm-hmm. But they sent me like a $30 gift card. And I found out later that the pharmacist had been fired because she'd been doing this to a bunch of other people. But under this proposed rule, like, that would just be fine. Like, you don't even have to give a reason not to treat a trans person. You could just say, no, I think they're icky and I don't want to touch their bodies. And again, right back to the 80s under the AIDS crisis where doctors just refused to, treat gay men and trans women who were infected with AIDS. It's just, it enables bad actors within the healthcare industry. There is precedent for people dying because of these types of refusals. So Robert Eads was a trans man, I think from Florida, but don't quote me on that. And he developed ovarian cancer, and he went to like an oncologist to get a biopsy, mm-hmm. and then never heard back with the results.
Oh, yes, I have heard this story. Yes.
Never heard back with the results, like figured, oh, I must not have had cancer.
Right. Everything's fine.
And like several months later, somebody, like an assistant within the practice called and was like, we just want to know how you're doing with your diagnosis. And he was like, what diagnosis? So he reached out to the oncologist to figure out what happened. And the guy was like, well, when I saw your transgender status, honestly, my first reaction was to refer you to psychiatry, but I figured I just wouldn't get in touch with you at all. And he ended up dying because nobody would take care of his ovarian cancer, right? So, like, these doctors basically can just refuse to treat life-threatening situations. And there was actually a trans woman who lived not far from here where we're recording today, who was in a car accident. The EMT responded, and, like, she had devastating injuries, and he cut her clothes off and saw her penis and then refused to touch her for the rest of the trip. To the hospital, they get to the ER. The ER staff was sort of standoffish about treating her, didn't really take it seriously. She ended up dying in the hospital. Not very far from here in D.C.
Right,
this was back in the 90s.
In Washington, D.C.
Yeah, back in the 90s. And under this proposed rule, that would be legal. And what they did to Robert Eads would be legal as well. And it's just frankly terrifying, honestly, as a trans person.
So I've talked about this before on the podcast, but so I'm from rural-ish Wisconsin. I went to undergrad at the University of Wisconsin, and I had two roommates who were from a fairly conservative religion, and both were going to go into medical-related fields, and both at certain points we're talking about, well, I would never treat a gay person or whatever, and just being like, that's not a thing. You can't do that. Like, they're people. You treat people if you're going to be a pharmacist or whatever. And it just didn't make sense to me. Like, that wasn't an option. Like, I don't understand. You're going into healthcare, you treat people.
Right.
Period. And come to find out, apparently this is something that medical professionals can choose to do, which it just boggles my mind. Why would you refuse to treat somebody, particularly in an emergency situation, but anytime?
Yeah.
It makes me so angry.
We talked before about how the media hasn't necessarily covered with us with a lot of depth, and I don't think the media necessarily realizes that these scenarios are possible. And I think they do the same thing when they're covering reproductive health, especially when they just print these frankly moronic Republican lawmakers who are like, oh yeah, you can just, transplant on top of pregnancy. And I'm just like, this isn't a thing. What is wrong with you?
That was the wildest. I mean, maybe not even the wildest, because there have been some pretty wild things. Like, well, yeah, they can just swallow a tiny camera and it can check out the uterus.
Oh my God, the
I'm
swallowing camera thing.
Those systems are not connected. God.
Or the Todd Aiken legitimate rape comments where he's like, the body has a way of shutting that down. And I'm like, no, it really doesn't.
And I think, some of it could be a little bit like, so I live in Washington, D.C. Okay, so this doctor isn't going to treat me. There's that doctor. There's options. It's not a big deal. Okay, they get to execute their religious liberty or their bigotry. Okay. But that's not true for a lot of people in a lot of places. There aren't other options. If they live in a rural community, there might not be another another pharmacy anywhere close. They might have to travel a long ways. Maybe the only provider in their rural area is a Planned Parenthood that's being targeted for other reasons. These things are all connected and all come back to we are all targets.
Yeah, and I've had an eye-opening experience myself recently because I mentioned that I had surgery that was the end of last year, but I've since had to find an OBGYN. And even around here, it's hard to find somebody who has treated a post-op trans vagina before. I eventually did find an amazing one who I absolutely adore. But then I think of Alabama, where it's 76 counties that don't even have an OB. It's just, how is a trans woman who's had surgery down there supposed to get adequate care when there might not even be an OB in the state who is willing to treat them, much less have experience with their body? It's just, and you see the same thing in rural places all over the country. I mean, I think I read, I know somebody who lives in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, and there's not a single hormone provider in the entire UP for trans people. These are all deficiencies in the health arena, and then along comes this administration going, oh my God, it's this huge problem that trans people are asking for medical care. And I'm like, it's really not. It's the opposite problem. We don't have so much of the healthcare discourse has turned to affordability, and here we are as trans people and repro professionals going, well, we still have access issues on our side of the dial. We're still 10 years behind you, where we're actually just trying to get basic access to these things. And I think that those of us within the repro sort of beat understand that that's happening, but I don't think people outside of us are even aware that you can't just show up at the hospital and demand bottom surgery. It's just
so yeah, that's absolutely one part of the lack of depth in the coverage, but the other part is the assuming being able to deny service to trans people is for trans care and not understanding that it's for care, for everything. They can turn you, or the depth of people who can turn you away, right? You talked about the ambulance situation. Now it's ambulance. It's the scheduler at the hospital could refuse to schedule an appointment. It's anybody within the healthcare system can turn you away. And that's not what it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Instead of, these people going out and learning how to treat for, trans people, they can be like, oh, that's too much of a bother for me. I don't even want to bother with it in the first place, right? Which we also see again when you talk about the fact that there aren't many medical schools that even teach how to perform an abortion. So again, parallels are happening all over the place.
Or even doctors who learned how to do IUDs.
I mean, I had to get when I first moved here, I had to get a pre-op physical just to make sure I was in good enough health to not die on the operating table. So I went to just an urgent care in the greater DC area, and it was just a basic physical. It had nothing to do with trans care, but you have to list your medications. And the guy is looking at, I'm taking 3 medications for my transition. One's estrogen, one is a testosterone blocker, and then one was a DHT blocker for hair loss, basically. And he's looking at this and he goes, are these the only things that you take for your gender transition? And I was like, yeah. He goes, you'd think it'd be some crazy drug concoction. And I'm like, no, it's just hormones, buddy. Like,
I mean, that's true. I think the veil of mystery for some people, even within clearly the medical profession, right?
Yeah, it's just really frustrating. And I can relate to these things because I've had these experiences, and like I'm an extremely privileged person within the trans community. So if I'm having these experiences, these are just rampant issues.
Yeah, and as someone who, has reported on it and knows how to navigate the medical system, I mean, that's another complication. And unrelated, but also worth talking about, is just the trans community being targets in general, with so many Black trans women who have been murdered. And every once in a while you'll see it come up, but not very often. That, I mean, this community really needs our help in so many ways.
Yeah, there have been 2 just in this area alone in the last couple months. It's just scary. And then somebody, so there's Casa Ruby on the other side of town, not far from here. There's this guy that showed up in the parking lot, like threatening people with a gun there. It's just, it's just scary.
It's just so important to show up and speak out. I have been meaning to do an episode on the trans community for so long, and I'm just so happy to have finally done it. For a while, it was everything's on fire under the Trump administration
really
with
is.
repro. So everything else kept popping up, and finally, I was just like, I need to make it happen. Like, I don't care. It needs to happen now. And unfortunately, there was the big impetus with the new rule that we talked about, where kind of anybody can refuse for any reason. It is a proposed rule, though, still, right?
Yes, as far as I know, yes.
The religious refusals is now a rule, but
yes, correct.
But the other one,
comments are
proposed.
open.
Yes,
protecttranshealth.org, I believe, is the website. You can go and submit a comment.
So perfect. What can listeners do to fight back? I always like to end all of these horribleness with a positive. So what can listeners do to fight back?
Yeah, so actually, before we get into individual listeners, I just wanted to give a shout out to so many repro organizations who are trans affirming and inclusive. Planned Parenthood and NARAL are both pretty trans inclusive. Every protest that's held, certainly in DC, has folks from the National Women's Law Center. So I definitely want to give them a shout out because they're always showing up. And they had a representative who spoke at the House hearing for the Equality Act, and she was like, I'm here because I'm with the National Women's Law Center, and trans rights are women's rights. And just to hear that as a trans person, and to know that there are these powerful organizations who are behind us, is actually a comfort, I know for me personally. But, when it comes to listeners, I think my first ask would be try to show up at protests. And I can't tell you how much the trans community will, particularly here in DC, will go to protests and we'll look around and it's like 10 trans people and like 3 cis people, and we're all yelling at the White House because it's always on, in Lafayette Park. And I can't tell you how disheartening it is to see the same 15 faces at protest after protest. So I would say, in your local community, there are trans protests happening, on behalf of the trans community. And I would encourage people to just show up. And you don't necessarily have to know the right language. You don't even have to necessarily be that vocal. Just having bodies there will do so much to just calm the fears of your trans neighbors. But beyond that, I would say, we have a desperate need for funding our healthcare needs. There's a great hashtag on Twitter, and I want to make sure I get this right, so let me take a minute to think about this. It's hashtag #transcrowdfund. So if you go on that hashtag, you're going to see literally thousands of trans people just like, with their GoFundMes for transition care and whatnot. And I'm somebody who I, basically financed all of my surgeries through GoFundMe as well. So this is an incredibly common thing. But, giving money directly to trans people, particularly Black trans women who are so often most affected by unemployment and lack of access to health care, is definitely like the easiest, most direct way to provide material support for trans people. But, beyond the financial side of things, like go to protecttranshealth.org and submit a comment. And they're going to roll out the proposed rule about the homeless shelters. And I think it would be amazing to have particularly cis women write in saying the shelter that I stay in, if I was homeless, should also include trans women, because I think that they are intentionally pitting cis women versus trans women in justifying this rule. And if we could get a couple of thousand comments from cis women saying no, like they belong with us, I think that would be really powerful. But I can't force anybody to make a statement like that. So, that would be my encouragement. Yeah, we just are just generally scared about the state of the world right now.
And unfortunately, that scare is warranted. And so it's really up to us cis women. We need to step up, and we need to speak out. Too. And cis men too. Yes.
You're not off the hook, dudes.
Everybody. We all need to be there and be in a supporting role and an amplifying role, to make sure that everybody's voices are being heard and to show our support.
And I would say to the trans listeners that you have, or maybe people who listen, who are like my Twitter followers, who listen to this show, I would say if you're trans, we need to show up for reproductive health for everybody, but especially for abortion access, because again, these issues are all connected. And if you follow me on Twitter, you've already heard me say this 1,000 times anyway, but yeah, we all should be showing up for each other.
Absolutely. Katelyn, thank you so much for doing this. This was fun.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
We'll definitely have to have you on again.
Definitely.
For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit our website at reprosfightback.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at reprosfightback. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends and subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks for listening.